The air inside Blackwood's tavern buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the smell of cheap beer and cigarette smoke. The dim lights cast long shadows on the worn wooden tables where a group of young men sat, deep in conversation. Leaning back with an arrogant smirk, Jake Carter raised his glass high. His dark eyes gleamed with the confidence that only alcohol and bravado could provide. "I don't fear anything," he declared, his voice thick with liquor and pride. "Not death, not the devil, not even ghosts." Laughter erupted around the table. But Ethan Sullivan, his best friend and the biggest instigator of trouble, leaned in with a grin. "Oh yeah?" he taunted, slamming his drink down. "Then prove it." The table went quiet. The challenge was unspoken, yet everyone knew what Ethan meant. Blackwood Cemetery, a graveyard on the outskirts of town, swallowed by fog and legend. Locals avoided it, whispering about the unmarked tomb of Richard Caldwell, a tyrant from the town's dark past. The man had lived without mercy and, according to legend, had died without it too. His name was carved into the stone alongside an ominous warning: "The traitor shall never rest." Ryan Matthews, the most level-headed of the group, stiffened. "This is a bad idea," he said, shaking his head. "People say his soul never left. That anyone who disturbs his grave never comes back the same." Jake rolled his eyes, chucking his empty glass onto the table. "Stories, that's all they are. Just superstitions for cowards." He cracked his knuckles. "But fine, if you want me to prove it, I will." Ethan grinned wickedly. "Good, but you're not going alone. Ryan's going with you." Ryan's stomach dropped. "What? No way." Jake clapped him on the shoulder, flashing a teasing grin. "What's wrong, Ryan? You scared?" Under the watchful eyes of Ethan and Olivia Carter, the only girl in the group and never one to back down from a thrill, Ryan exhaled sharply. "Fine," he muttered, running a hand down his face. "But this is stupid." The group left the tavern, stepping into the icy night. The streets of Blackwood were deathly silent, the distant sound of crickets the only sign of life. The deeper they walked into the outskirts, the heavier the air grew, as if the night itself was watching. By the time they reached the rusted iron gates of Blackwood Cemetery, Ryan's pulse pounded in his ears. The graveyard stretched before them like an ancient wound, tilted tombstones jutting out like broken teeth, vines twisting around forgotten names, and a cold that sank deep into his bones. Jake scoffed and strode forward. "See? Just a bunch of old rocks and dead people." He glanced back at Ryan. "You coming, or are you gonna run home?" Ryan hesitated. Then, in the corner of his eye, he saw it, a white owl perched atop a gravestone, staring unblinking into the dark. A bad omen. "Jake, we shouldn't be here," Ryan whispered. Jake laughed, the sound carrying through the empty night. "Relax. It's just a stupid old grave." Then he walked deeper into the cemetery. Ryan had no choice but to follow, completely unaware that something was already watching them. The cemetery loomed before them, swallowed in a blanket of eerie silence. The once distant sound of crickets and rustling leaves had faded, leaving only the soft howl of the wind. Ryan felt his stomach coil into a tight knot as he followed Jake deeper into the graveyard. Every instinct told him to turn back, but Jake moved forward without a hint of hesitation. They came to a stop in front of a weathered, cracked tombstone. The engraving was barely legible in the dim moonlight, but the name still sent a shiver down Ryan's spine. Richard Caldwell, 1865 to 1910. "The traitor shall never rest." Ryan swallowed hard. Everyone in Blackwood knew the legend, how Caldwell had once ruled the town with cruelty, exploiting the workers in his factories and driving entire families into poverty. Some said he had made a pact with something dark, something not of this world. When he was finally killed, no one mourned him, but his curse remained. Ryan turned to Jake. "All right, we're here. You've proven your point. Let's go." Jake chuckled. "What's the rush? Scared of a little dirt?" Ryan's jaw tightened. This isn't a joke. But Jake just smirked. "I think it is." With that, he took a step forward and spat on the grave. Ryan felt his breath hitch. "Jake, stop." Jake grinned. "Relax. If Caldwell was so powerful, he should come up here and tell me himself." The wind picked up, whistling through the tombstones like a whisper in the dark. Ryan clenched his fists. "Jake, Let's just. Then Jake unzipped his jeans. Ryan lunged forward. Don't. But the moment the first drop of urine hit the grave, the entire cemetery seemed to react. The wind turned into a deafening howl. Sweeping through the graveyard like an unseen force was stirring from the depths. The air grew thick, cold, suffocating. Trees groaned under the force of the sudden gust, and the old iron gate at the entrance creaked ominously. The distant hoot of an owl shattered the silence, a cry so sharp and unnatural that Ryan felt his blood turn to ice. Jake stumbled back, fumbling to zip his jeans. What the hell was that? Then, a deep, echoing crack. Both boys snapped their heads toward the grave. A thick, jagged fracture had appeared down the center of the tombstone, splitting the name Richard Caldwell in two. Ryan took a shaky step back. That wasn't there before. Jake swallowed hard. Must have been just old stone. Man, it happens. Then, the ground knocked. Talk, talk, talk. Ryan froze. His heart slammed against his ribs. Jake let out a nervous laugh. Just the ground settling? Talk, talk, talk. Louder, more insistent. Ryan grabbed Jake's arm. We need to go, now. Jake didn't move. His cocky smirk had vanished, replaced by something else, fear. Then, the whisper came. It was low, guttural, ancient. You belong to me. Jake staggered back, his face draining of color. What the? Before he could finish, the earth trembled beneath their feet. Ryan yanked Jake's arm and bolted, dragging him toward the cemetery gate. The wind howled in their ears, carrying something with it, footsteps. Slow, heavy, following. They ran faster, lungs burning, hearts hammering against their ribs. Every shadow seemed to move, twisting and stretching toward them. Then, silence. Ryan and Jake burst through the cemetery gates, stumbling onto the empty street. The world was still. No wind, no whispers, no footsteps. Panting, Jake doubled over. What the hell just happened? Ryan turned back toward the graveyard. The tombstone was still there, unchanged. But in the distance, something moved. And this time, it wasn't in the cemetery. It was behind them. Jake and Ryan ran like their lives depended on it, tearing through the empty streets of Blackwood. The night air was thick, suffocating, as if the entire town had turned against them. Every shadow seemed to slither closer. Every gust of wind carried whispers they couldn't quite understand. By the time they reached Ryan's house, they were breathless, drenched in sweat. Ryan fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped them. Click. The lock turned. They slammed the door shut behind them, bolting it. For a moment, neither spoke. They just stood there, panting, listening to the sound of their own racing heartbeats. Jake was the first to break the silence. He forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. Okay, that was something. Ryan leaned against the wall, his face pale. Something? Jake, that was not normal. You saw it. You heard it. Jake exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Yeah, man, I don't know. Maybe it was just in our heads? Ryan shook his head. Wind doesn't whisper your name. Silence. Then, a loud bang. The sound came from inside the house. Ryan stiffened. Jake turned toward the hallway. Another bang. Closer this time. Jake swallowed. Dude, tell me that was just the pipes. Ryan's voice came out in a whisper. My house doesn't have old pipes. Then, footsteps. Talk, talk, talk. Slow, deliberate, coming from the darkened hallway. Jake's skin prickled. Nope, nope, I'm leaving. He reached for the doorknob. But just as his fingers touched the cold metal, it twisted on its own. Click. The lock slid shut. Jake recoiled as if burned. He tried to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. Dude, it locked itself. Ryan's pulse pounded in his ears. The house was silent again, too silent. Then, the lights flickered. A shadow moved at the end of the hallway. Jake saw it. Ryan saw it. Neither dared to breathe. Talk, talk, talk. Closer. Ryan's voice was barely audible. We're not alone. A whisper slithered through the air. You belong to me. Jake's breath hitched. His eyes darted around the room, wild with fear. Ryan, what the hell was that? Before Ryan could answer, the hallway door slammed shut. Bang. The entire house shuddered. The temperature plummeted. Ryan could see his breath now, curling in the air like ghostly smoke. Jake stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. No, 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 this isn't real. Ryan grabbed his arm, his fingers ice cold. We need to get out. Now. But before they could move, the TV turned on. Static hissed through the room, sharp and ear-splitting. Then, the static twisted, morphing. A face appeared. A man. His features were warped. His eyes were bottomless pits of darkness. His mouth curled into a grotesque snarl. Ryan's stomach dropped. Jake choked out a whisper. That's... The face twitched. The image flickered. Then, the voice came again. You defiled my grave, and now, you will pay. Ryan grabbed a book, the closest thing within reach, and hurled it at the TV. Crack. The screen exploded in sparks. For a moment, there was silence. Then, all the lights in the house went out. Total darkness. Jake's breathing was ragged. Ryan? Ryan's hands were shaking. I know. The air thickened. The silence stretched. And then, talk, talk, talk. The footsteps returned. Inside the room, Jake and Ryan weren't alone. And whatever was with them, wasn't leaving. Jake and Ryan stood frozen in the suffocating darkness. Their breaths shallow, their bodies rigid with fear. The air around them had thickened, heavy with an unspoken presence, as though something unseen lurked just beyond the edge of the dim light. The entire house had fallen into an eerie stillness until the footsteps began again. Talk, talk, talk. The sound echoed through the walls, measured and deliberate. Jake swallowed hard, his pulse a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He turned to Ryan, his voice barely above a whisper. Tell me you heard that. Ryan didn't answer. His trembling hands fumbled for his phone, the screen flickering to life. He swept the flashlight beam across the room. Nothing, except Jake's stomach clenched. The closet door, which had been shut just moments ago, now stood slightly ajar. Ryan's breath hitched. That was closed before. Jake nodded stiffly. Yeah. A whisper slithered through the air, low and raspy, curling around them like smoke. You shouldn't have come back. Ryan tightened his grip on the phone. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet refused to move. Jake, however, took a cautious step backward, his heart hammering against his chest. And then, the closet door creaked open further. Jake lunged for Ryan's arm. Nope, we're leaving. But before they could move, the door to the room slammed shut. Bang. The entire house shuddered. The light overhead flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows along the walls. Ryan's flashlight wavered as he turned toward the closet, just in time to see something move. Jake barely had time to react before a hand, pale, skeletal, rotting, shot out and clamped onto Ryan's wrist. Ryan let out a strangled scream, stumbling backward, trying to shake it off. The grip was ice cold, tightening like iron shackles. Jake lunged forward, grabbing Ryan's other arm, yanking him back with all his strength. Let go of him. For a moment, Ryan felt as though he were being pulled between two worlds. The pressure around his wrist was unbearable, as if something was dragging him into the abyss. Then, suddenly, it released. Ryan collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed Ryan and dragged him toward the door. He didn't care where they ran, they just had to get out. They sprinted down the hallway. But the house wasn't the same anymore. The walls had stretched, the doors had vanished, and the shadows clung to them like living things. And the voice followed them. You think you can escape? Ryan's hands shook as he reached for the doorknob at the end of the hall. But his fingers passed through it. The hallway ahead of them twisted, warped. Jake grabbed Ryan's shoulder, his voice hoarse. Ryan, this isn't real. Ryan turned to look behind them, only to see that the hallway they had just run through was gone. They were trapped. The flickering light overhead sputtered once more. And then, total darkness. A sharp, cold breath brushed against Jake's ear. I am with you now. Ryan fumbled for his phone, his fingers slipping over the screen. When the flashlight beam flickered back on, he regretted it instantly, because the face was right there. Rotting flesh, hollow eyes, a twisted grin. Ryan let out a choked scream. Dropping the phone, the light spun wildly across the floor before going out completely. Bam! Jake felt something slam into his chest. sending him flying backward. His back hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. Ryan scrambled toward him. Jake. Jake gasped, his vision blurring. His chest ached as though something had sunk its claws into him. He tried to speak, but then a hand wrapped around his ankle. His scream barely made it past his lips before he was yanked backward into the void. Ryan lunged, grabbing Jake's arm. No. Jake's fingers grasped at Ryan's, trying to hold on, but the force was too strong. Jake's fingers slipped through Ryan's grip. And then, he was gone. Ryan stared at the empty space where Jake had been, his mind unable to process what had just happened. His best friend had been dragged into the darkness. Jake. His scream shattered the silence. But there was no answer. Only the whisper. Now it's your turn. Ryan stumbled backward, his entire body trembling. He reached for the wall, trying to steady himself, but the shadows slithered toward him, reaching out like tendrils. His breath came in ragged gasps. His pulse pounded against his skull. The darkness moved. It surged forward, swallowing the room, and then, everything went black. Ryan fell. It felt like plummeting into an endless abyss. His body weightless, suspended in nothingness. He tried to scream, but the sound was devoured by the void. Then, from the darkness, a voice. Low, hollow, terrifying. You were warned. Ryan hit the ground hard. His limbs ached, his head spinning. He gasped, blinking rapidly. The world around him had changed. He was no longer in the house. He was standing in a graveyard. The air was thick with fog, curling around the crumbling tombstones like skeletal fingers. The sky overhead was void of stars, a suffocating blackness stretching endlessly in every direction. Ryan's breath caught in his throat as his eyes landed on a single grave. The name was barely visible beneath the moss-covered stone, but he recognized it immediately. Jake Miller. Ryan's body went cold. No, this isn't real. A hand, Jake's hand, shot up from the earth. Clawing at the dirt, Ryan stumbled backward, shaking his head in horror. Jake? Jake's voice was barely a whisper. Help me. Ryan turned, ready to run, but the voice spoke again. You can't leave. And then, something grabbed his shoulder. A frozen grip latched onto Ryan's shoulder, sinking through his skin like ice-cold iron. His breath hitched, his chest locking up as fear curled its way around his ribs. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but his body, his mind, refused to obey. Slowly, he turned his head, and his blood curdled. The figure behind him wasn't human. Its skin, gray and rotting, peeled away in strips. Hollow sockets gaped where eyes should have been, and a jagged mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. You shouldn't have come back. The voice wasn't spoken. It slithered into Ryan's mind, filling every corner of his consciousness. His pulse pounded in his ears, hammering against his skull. He fought to swallow, but his throat had turned to sandpaper. You're not real. He rasped, his voice barely a whisper. The thing tightened its grip. Neither are you. Ryan's vision blurred. The world tilted. A deep, rumbling groan rose from the ground beneath him. The air thickened, swirling with something unseen but suffocating. Then, from the earth, a hand burst free. Jake's hand. Ryan's stomach plummeted. He watched, paralyzed, as his best friend clawed his way out of the dirt. His fingers bloodied and raw. But Jake wasn't alone. From the cracked grave, dozens of hands emerged, grasping, pulling, dragging. Jake gasped, his wide, terrified eyes locking onto Ryan's. Don't let them take me. Ryan lunged forward, fingers wrapping around Jake's wrist. Jake's grip was desperate, human. For a moment, just one moment, Ryan believed he could save him. Then, from the depths below, a whisper, mine, and they yanked Jake back. Ryan screamed, bracing his feet, pulling harder, but it was useless. The grave widened, a hungry, gaping maw. Jake's fingers slipped. His face was the last thing to vanish beneath the soil. His expression wasn't one of terror anymore. It was acceptance. The grave sealed shut. The night fell silent. Ryan collapsed onto his knees, his breath coming in ragged, shuddering gasps. It was over. Or at least, he thought it was. A soft wind whispered through the cemetery, chilling him to his core. Ryan sat frozen, unable to move. And then, he heard it. A whisper. "You're next." His breath caught. His skin prickled. He felt it before he saw it, a presence behind him. Slowly, he turned. Jake stood there. But it wasn't Jake. His skin was sickly pale. His eyes two black voids. Endless and empty. His lips curled into something that should have been a smile. But wasn't. Ryan staggered backward. "Jake?" The thing tilted its head. Its neck cracking with emotion. "I told you, you can't leave." The wind roared. The darkness swallowed him whole. Blank. Blank. 1 year later. The town had moved on. People whispered about what had happened, passing it off as just another ghost story. Another cautionary tale to keep reckless teens from disturbing the dead. But some knew the truth. At the edge of town, nestled in the farthest corner of the cemetery, a new grave had appeared. It sat right beside Jake's. The inscription read, Ryan Turner, 1999 to 2023. Gone, but never forgotten. A lone figure stood before the graves, his hands tucked into his pockets. Raoul Carter, the only survivor of that night. His breath fogged in the crisp evening air as he stared at the stone. 2 names, side by side, 2 lives that had been swallowed by something far older, far hungrier than death itself. His fingers curled into fists. "I'm sorry." The wind picked up, whispering through the trees, and then, he heard it. Soft at first, almost impossible to catch. A voice. "You will be, soon enough." Raoul stiffened. The cold deepened, and from the shadows of the cemetery, unseen but felt, something moved.